The idea today is to develop and talk deeper about some of the concepts and ideas that we presented on the session on Sunday. And this is about climate justice. So the question is what climate justice is, which are the key elements of climate justice, and the politics, and the indicators. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then at the end we will have some questions and debate if we can. First thing to say, climate justice is not a concept, it's not an academic concept. It comes from the movements, and it has been developed as a movement. When we say it comes from the movements, we are talking about peasants' movements, fisher folks, students, trade unions, indigenous peoples, communities in the rural areas, but also in the cities. So it is important to have in mind that first, because we don't have a really academic ABC development, but at the same time to understand that this is ongoing. It's an ongoing discussion, and it is a process of building in a joint way of discussion, but also a political process. That is where we start from. That is our starting point, and I will come back to this later. I think there are questions about trade unions, there are questions about peasants. Of course, they are the ones to answer themselves, but what I can do is share with you what we have discussed until now. Which are the consequences of climate change, of the climate crisis? I think we have heard enough about the crisis and the possible impacts, and we have seen enough of what is happening. It's not something that is going to happen in the future, it's something that is happening already, and we are seeing the extreme climate events like the floods, like the typhoons, like the droughts, and we are seeing people dying. So that's happening. We are also seeing how the patterns for harvest are changing already. So that is not something like a catastrophe that is going to happen in the future. We are experiencing that. But this is not something out of our minds. It's not something in the nature, and we as different people, like divided, we are being already affected. And of course, it is different for countries in the south than for countries in the north. We cannot have that out of the debate. The conflicts that are generated are very different. So that's, I don't want to spend so much time on the consequences, because I think that is already known for most of you. But what I want to do is to talk more about which are the causes for that, and which are the solutions that are being proposed, and which are the solutions that we propose, and which are the problems that we find to those more institutional solutions that are being proposed. First of all, which are the causes of the climate crisis? It is said that the excess of greenhouse gas emissions is the cause of the climate or the global warming. So if we look at that, then we have two options: to see where those emissions come from, and how are those emissions being produced and used, or just try to count those emissions and try to see, okay, what are we going to do to reduce those numbers? And that is the difference between the two ways of seeing the current crisis. The origin of the climate crisis is related to the industrial and production model. The industrial production model, the consumption model, the endless consumption model. So what are we talking about when we say this? For example, I will bring many ideas about coal extraction, but it's not only about coal. So when we say the industrial production model, we need to see which are the energy sources for this industrial production. And that is when coal becomes so important. Not only coal, but also oil, but also gas, and the new sources of energy. But it is not only the sources of energy, but also other minerals. So what we were listening yesterday in the session here in the evening about the extraction of copper is also related to this. So we are talking about extracting minerals. We are talking about a mining energy model that is being deepened more and more. And it has impacts. The main impacts are related to the grabbing of the territories. So when we say territories, we are not talking only about land, which is very important, but also about the relationship between the communities and the land. And in order to extract those resources, the territories, the land, the water, the resources themselves are being grabbed from the communities. That is what is happening to have raw materials, to have energy sources, to continue producing and satisfying these new needs created, these endless needs created. That is like the initial part. And if we see how communities are resisting to that, how communities are being affected and are being murdered, we can see that at the same time that we have this lifestyle, at the same time that we have this consumption model, we have inequality and we have destruction and we have grabbing. So that is in the basis of the climate crisis. And why is all this produced? Why is all this extracted? Is to trade. Yeah? So the global trade system is also one of the main causes of the crisis. The so-called free trade agreements and the trade itself, the global trade system itself, is one of the main causes. First, because we need a lot of energy to transport the goods that we are exchanging. And that produces a lot of emissions. That is one of the main sources of emissions. Second, because we don't really need that much trade. We really don't need to import potatoes in Germany from Colombia, let's say. So it is not needed to continue and deepening the trade, but we do. So on one side, we continue doing this trade of raw materials for industrial production and for an endless consumption, but on the other side, we are trading goods that we don't need. So that is the basis of this climate crisis. But this is from an economic perspective. So if we look a little bit deeper into the cultural and political perspectives, there are also causes of this crisis that we need to address. And to talk about the political part, it's important to see which are the drivers of this economic model. And we refer always to corporations as main drivers. They are the ones who are extracting, they are the ones who are grabbing territories, and they are the ones who are profiting from this extraction. They are the ones who are profiting from trade. And they, at the same time, are capturing the state, and the policies are ruling in their favor, in most of the cases. So that's from a more political perspective, and then we are talking about power. Corporate power is one of the, is the driver behind this. We are not saying that states are not responsible. States actually are complicit of the crisis, and they are complicit of the false solutions, but it's a two ways of crisis. And on the other hand, we are talking about these consumptions, this endless consumption, and this production model. And we think that we need that. So the idea, this paradigm of growth, this paradigm of development, this idea that we human beings are in the center of everything and that nature works for us, that we can use nature for whatever we need, that is also the basis of this crisis and is the basis of this exploitation and extraction. So we need to change both our paradigm, our way of seeing that, and also through changing that, change the production and consumption system themselves. It is important to refer to this idea of progress because in some regions it is not that important. This idea of progress was like brought to us as something that we need. We need to have more, we need to live better, and in that way what we have is not enough. This idea of endless consumption and not enoughness is what has been the guarantee to continue consuming. And that's what we need to stop. Communities in many places say, we don't need that consumption, we don't need to grow, but they have learned that it is progress and that living better is what they need. So that is the key point in changing. This is when we look at the causes, that is how we can see that we need a real change. However, I was saying corporations and state are complicit. And they are complicit first on not recognizing the crisis and the real causes of the crisis, but second, by denying the crisis and by denying the real reasons of the crisis, they are also complicit on looking for false solutions. When we talk about false solutions, we want to describe more what are those false solutions. First of all, they are solutions that try to address the general problem. So when I was saying counting greenhouse gas emissions, that's it. That is a false solution. But these false solutions have another objective, which is related to the economic crisis. We are facing a financial and economic crisis. And the finance capital needs a way out to continue profiting. So how can we solve, from the state and from the capital perspective, how can we solve this situation? On one hand, show that we are doing something to solve the climate change crisis, and on the other hand, solve the financial capital crisis. Okay, so what we can do is create new commodities. New commodities from wherever, and then we can start profiting from that. And that's what they have been doing with the carbon markets. So they started to say, we need to create a new commodity, carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, reductions. How do we create a market from that? We have an indicator, we have a target. So countries need to reduce this amount and they can exchange. And so just the idea of counting and trying to reduce a number, but not the reality, that is the origin for that financialization and for that commodification. And that was like a model. The carbon markets were a model. But now this idea of financial commodities, the financial capital out of nature, is being developed more and more on life. So we are seeing how nature is took over by this financial capital. And in this case, yes, we started with carbon, but then it is going to biodiversity, it is going to oceans and water sources, it is going to the forests and to the ecosystem. So the natural process that are developed by forests, for example, or by ecosystems, now appear as services. And from services, now we create as well an asset. Yeah? And through that, we are solving the financial crisis. But also, this is not only about nature. I have been saying this is also about society. So what peasants, what indigenous communities do as their traditions by taking care of the territory, by interacting with the territory, now becomes a service as well. And as a service, it can be tradable. And it can be tradable at a local level, but at the financial level. And so the communities themselves stop being communities and they start being providers of the services. Everything now is part of the market. The same market system, the same market model that brought us to this crisis. So that is what is happening. But at the same time, so we are talking about the financial sphere that appears to be far away from us, but that same financialization is deepening the extraction of the resources. It's deepening the social and environmental conflicts caused by direct extraction. It's deepening the grabbing, the dispossession. It's deepening the rights violations. So this relation between nature and humans is being broken, and that is reinforced by this financial idea. What happened with this idea of commodification, financialization? We were told that if we count, we are valuing, but we are not valuing, we are putting a price on things. So we are measuring things that are not measurable, and we are pricing and paying things that are not payable. That is the problem, and that's why I was referring to the need of a civilization and more paradigm change, because we need to understand that nature is not something that we can pay for. It is something that we relate to. We are part of nature, and we cannot pay for that. We cannot just count and create indicators for that. What else are the institutions doing? So they are creating not only all this financial system, this financial sphere of many assets and commodities that reinforces the grabbing, but they are also supporting other ways of grabbing. And that is also what we call false solutions, including, for example, agrofuels. And the agrofuels are also a way of grabbing. To that development of agrofuels, we relate the concept of flex crops as ways of using the big crops to grab and change their target according to the most profitable business. But they are also corporatizing the renewable energy. So we can say, yes, wind energy or solar energy are renewable, are alternatives, but they are being corporatized. And by the corporatization of the renewable energies, we are seeing more grabbing. And we are seeing more extraction. So it becomes a problem again. What is the problem? We cannot continue having the same energy demand that we have until now. That cannot happen with any energy source if we want a sustainable society. It is also being proposed to have techno-fixes. So we can have these geoengineering brick projects of creating these artificial clouds to try to capture the CO2 emissions. We can try to develop the biomass. So those techno-fixes have even more problems and more risks. But that is the way of looking into alternatives from the capital perspective, just to stop being looking for the real solutions. And I was saying, this becomes from the institutions, and just to say, okay, which are the institutions, which are the spaces where this is discussed? That question was raised yesterday in the evening session about Paris, and I know most of you know that. So just to mention that the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change is the space where most of these policies are being proposed, but it's not the only space. Yeah, there are other conventions of the UN, like the Convention on Biodiversity, but also through the international financial institutions, most of these projects are being promoted and sponsored. So that's the institutional space, but as I was saying, that is linked and promoted by corporations. That's why we say there is a corporate capture of the UN, of the institutions, of the states. We cannot say that we will have a success agreement in Paris. We will see an agreement in Paris, but that agreement is most likely to be working for corporations. And here I want to bring a concept that is very important for us. In the negotiations, one of the main discussions for years from the environmental movements has been we need binding obligations on reductions from countries and from corporations. We need it to become binding. As well as we have been saying for years, we need binding obligations for corporations to pay for their crimes. And we have been demanding that for years. We have been demanding binding obligations for corporations. And what we are seeing is more and more voluntary pledges, voluntary commitments, voluntary guidelines. That is what is coming from corporations. And at the same time, we are seeing more and more corporate rights. And those rights are binding. So we say there is an architecture of impunity for corporations. There is impunity to continue polluting, to continue grabbing, and to continue dispossessing and displacing people from their territories. One example that I want to bring here from this architecture of impunity and these corporate rights is related to trade and investment agreements, just to see how all struggles are linked. You know, there is an energy charter in Europe, and that charter provides some rights and protection for investors. Maybe most of you know, because this is a case in Germany, that there was a decision to ban the nuclear energy in Germany. Vattenfall, the Sweden company, I think, the Sweden company, had invested on energy, on nuclear energy in Germany. So after the ban to nuclear energy, Vattenfall said, I'm losing money out of this. And they filed a legal claim against Germany because of that. So now, it is not still failed, it is on a process. There have been 2 legal claims against Germany by Vattenfall because they are losing money out of this ban. So what happens? The environmental rights, the rights of people who say, we don't want more nuclear energy. We don't want, to make another example, in El Salvador, we don't want more mining extraction in our territory, are affecting the profits from the investors. They are affecting corporate rights. And in a difference from the people, the corporations, the investors, have instruments to claim for that. The instrument is called Investor-to-State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which allows them to file these claims, and through these claims, demand from the states the payment of incredible amounts of money for that. Yeah, so we don't have the ways to make them respect their rights, but they do have ways to make them rights binding. And that is what we call architecture of impunity. So this is a very depressive panorama, if we can say. But at the same time, we need to see that there are options and there are alternatives. And ideas like degrowth, like climate justice, like sustainable societies are being proposed from movements, from organizations, and from communities. Just to add one more thing to the corporate capture of these ideas, it is important to say that the resistances and the arguments we are using are so valid that they are tried to be captured also by governments. So, for example, the critics to the growth become then on a proposal for development in the 60s. And then when we were saying development is not what we want, and we have problems, we are facing this environmental crisis, okay, then you have sustainable development. And then when sustainable development was clearly failing because it was a way of painting, green painting, and saying that society can reach its objectives, then they came with the proposal for green economy in 2012 in Rio. So that is happening always. And now, when we see the World Bank saying we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, or when we see Merkel saying climate justice is an important pillar of the policy, we need to look into that and see how empty are those proposals. And at the same time, how risky are those proposals. They are capturing our concepts, they are capturing our language, but they are keeping the same problem, the same systemic problem intact. So what we want to do is to think on the need of a system change. That is the real proposal from climate justice. And the first point for these struggles is to say it's right to say no. It's right to reject. We are always being said, yeah, you are too negative. You need alternatives. Yes, we do have alternatives. But resisting is an alternative on itself. Getting to know other resistances and getting to understand that other struggles are our struggles, that is part of the alternative. Deepening the solidarity and understanding that the extraction of coal here is related to the extraction of coal in Colombia and is related to the extraction of other minerals in Malaysia and in other regions of the world makes us understanding that is not the struggle of one village, but the resistance in the territories are key. The resistance in the territories and the defense of the territories are the basis for the system change. So the alternatives are coming also from these resistances and from the territories. What do we think as an alternative? It is really difficult to develop each one. As I was saying at the beginning, it is a process, a political process of discussion. But I will mention some of them as the key pillars of our proposals. So first, I mentioned on Sunday the climate debt, the environmental historical debt from the north to the south. This extraction that we have been talking about, the destruction that has already happened, in order to guarantee the lifestyle, the life condition, the development pattern that it is existing in the north, it caused a debt with the south, with the global south. And that we need to politicize that concept. It's not about paying in cash. It's not only about how much gold and minerals the colonies extracted from our regions and brought to Europe 500 years ago. That is the historical debt. It's also about the cheap labor that they have been exploiting for 500 years and today. And it's also about the destruction of the territories and the communities. And that is not payable with cash. Again, we don't want indicators. We don't want measures. It is a political debt. And we need to repoliticize that concept. What other alternatives do we have? I was saying the defending territory sovereignty is one of the key pillars of our proposals, and territory understood as a deeper relation with the land, with the water, and the way that we produce in the territory, but also the way that we develop our cultural links to the land. And that is really important. It's not only about changing the house which was here, like we have seen this ghost village, this ghost town close by. It's not only about changing it and giving a new house in a different place. There are roots in the territories. There have been stories for people in these territories. And these links, this relation, for indigenous communities, but also for peasants and for people in the cities are really important. So it's not a matter of offsetting one place to the other. We also need to understand that our cultural traditions are not offsettable, are not tradable. Food sovereignty, that's one of the key demands and proposals from the peasants' movements, from Villa Campesina, and as they said, the agroecology cools the planet. So instead of thinking that we need industrial production to feed the planet, we can see that through agroecology we can, again, have livelihoods, have more sovereignty, have more richness in the food itself, but also we are helping to reduce the emissions. So that is one important demand. Energy sovereignty implies just to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, implies community management of energy, so it's not related, as I was saying before, to corporate management or corporatization of renewables. It's a community management of energy, and it also implies what are we using the energy for whom are we extracting, and for whom are we producing the energy? Feminist economy. Feminist movements, women have said the patriarchal and capitalist system is the basis of this. So women, we have an important role, not saying like we are the ones who will save this. No, we need an equal system. We need fairness, and we need to recognize the rights of women, and from the perspective of the care economy, we need to recognize how women have an important role, and by rejecting and destroying the patriarchal system, we can also think on real solutions, systemic solutions, and for sure climate and environmental sustainable solutions. And just to add finally, trade unions. I know there are many conflicts with trade unions, but workers live in the same planet. They are also part of the territory. They are not an actor far away, and they are aware of that. So they are also making proposals for climate justice. They are talking about just transition, climate jobs. It is something as the other proposals that we need to discuss. But the idea of just transition and understanding that all of us need solutions and need real and systemic solutions, it is also part of the trade unions movement. I know there are debates, it is different in Latin America than it's different in Europe, but the awareness of the crisis is also between trade unions, and there have been very interesting debates among themselves and the environmental movements and peasants movements that have reached interesting agreements and proposals on how do we understand this just transition. To finish, I will say there is no one proposal for climate justice. There is no one proposal from the Global South. And we don't think that the buen vivir, which comes from the Andean communities, can be applied in Europe as it is. Or the Ubuntu from the African communities can be applied in Latin America. There are other proposals like economies for life, like the commons, the growth, and we need to exchange as we are doing here, and we need to learn from each other's experiences. But what is in common between all these proposals is a different set of values. Is a different idea of justice. We need social, environmental justice, and we can achieve that from different perspectives. We need a shift of paradigm. As the indigenous communities say, we need a civilizatory change. So this is something that goes beyond these patches, but it is about a common value and a common change. So I think I'll leave now like this, just to add one more thing and the question on the dialogue between degrowth and the global south. I mentioned this before. The concept of development and the idea of the right to development needs to be questioned and is being questioned by organizations, communities in the south. I have heard many communities saying, we don't want development. And I think that talks a lot with the degrowth proposal, and what we need is alternatives to development and alternatives to the capitalism. Thank you.